Chidimma Adetshina has won Miss Universe Nigeria. So she will be going to Mexico to represent Nigeria and to compete for the Miss Universe title. And what a ride it has been. She recently has commented in an interview about her reflections on how people responded to her performance in Miss Universe South Africa. This is what she had to say.
It all started because of my name. People were not happy that my name is Chidimma and I am representing South Africa. So that is where it actually really started. And you know, people felt like, well, South Africans felt like I wasn't South African enough because of my name. And it was really sad to see. It was a very horrible experience and I wouldn't wish it on anybody because I have lived there for 23 years. And it's heartbreaking to see that I wasn't welcomed and accepted.
Yeah. Okay.
That's okay.
Well, you are welcome here.
But you're welcome here, and you're the queen.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. I just didn't want to talk about it, but yeah, it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking, and there were certain things that happened behind the scene that actually made me withdraw, and it was so heartbreaking to see that I had to withdraw close to the finale, and but a decision had to be made, and it really hit social media as well.
Yeah.
And there was some statements that came out from Home Affairs with regards to my mom's ID as well, and that is still a legal matter, so I'm not going to comment on that. But what I do know is that I was born in South Africa and I am a South African, and I'm still proudly Nigerian as well. And I was really excited to get an invitation from Silverbird to represent Nigeria in the Miss Universe Nigeria, to see that they saw that potential, and the love that I've received, it has been exceptional, not only from the group, from the organization, from the girls, but from Nigeria as well and all over the world. And that's my whole journey.
Chidimma Adetshina is right when she says that some people immediately rejected her as being a contender for the Miss South Africa title. Some people heard the name Chidimma Adetshina and they said never, can never happen, not in South Africa. Some people did that. She's right. She would have seen that. It affects her. It pertains to her. She's correct that some people have done that. You know, another example which is accessible and even more recent, when Dada Morero became the mayor of Johannesburg, and then he said that, you know, they need to get translators to work for the Johannesburg Metro Police Department so that they can help in instances where the police are dealing with immigrants who are being questioned, etc. And he was concerned that those people would speak in foreign languages. And then he said, look, maybe we need translators. The idea in and of itself was not necessary. I did a video showing how there are other solutions which are cheaper, more accessible and easier to do than that solution, and it wasn't a necessity. But what I noticed in the comments were that people started talking about the shape of his head, saying that, Dada Morero, his head is not shaped right. Then they started saying, what kind of a name is Dada? What country does that name come from? Then they started saying, Morero, what language is that? Where does it come from? So even with him, he is a South African, he is a mayor of Johannesburg, he's a member of the ANC in good standing, but some people were willing to just dismiss him outright just because of his name, his surname, and the shape of his head. That happens. So she's correct. I also think that that video, which she shot with her father and cousins and uncles, that video was very unapologetically Nigerian in its stature, in the mannerisms. It was very proud, and they were doing hand gestures, go away, whatever. And that, I think, aggravated some people who are uncomfortable with Nigerians living in South Africa, uncomfortable with immigrants living in South Africa. That felt like it was disrespectful. It felt like it was arrogant. And I think it escalated attention towards her, and it escalated this discourse that, she was not necessarily South African, that she was not proudly South African, that her Instagram, for instance, didn't have a South African flag, or her TikTok, and that therefore she was somebody who was proudly Nigerian competing for Miss South Africa, and because she lacked patriotism, she shouldn't qualify. Of course, the investigation that Home Affairs did indicated that her mother had done something which is still under investigation, but potentially that she stole someone's identity. But Chidimma was born in South Africa and has a South African ID number, and there's international law that pertains to her specific status, because someone cannot be rendered stateless if they don't have dual citizenship, and that is just the Citizenship Act. That's what it says. So there are some dynamics around that. So I think she's correct to say that some people behaved like that. Other people had legitimate questions when they listened to what her father said, when they listened to the timeline of some of the stuff that was being discussed. Some people had legitimate questions and they were asking those legitimate questions, but other people did not. On the other side of this equation, I want to discuss something as well. And before I discuss that thing, I want to talk about this concept of hasty generalization. I have a textbook. I'm an avid debater, and back in the days, I was studying this stuff formally at university. There's something from this textbook that I want to read about fallacies. So firstly, I'll start off with the definition of a fallacy and talk about what a fallacy means. And then I will talk about a specific fallacy, right? So each fallacy is a type of incorrect argument. Since it is a type of incorrect argument and not a particular argument, we can say of two different arguments that they contain or commit the same fallacy, right? So let me find a more specific definition. An argument whose premises do not imply its conclusion is one whose conclusion could be false, even if all of its premises are true. An argument that fails in this second way is said to be fallacious or to be a fallacy. People are said to commit fallacies when they reason this way. So, it is customary in the study of logic to reserve the term fallacy for arguments that are psychologically persuasive but logically incorrect, that do as a matter of fact persuade, but given certain argumentative standards shouldn't. We therefore define fallacy as a type of argument that seems to be correct, but that proves on examination not to be so. There's profit in studying such arguments for familiarity and understanding, to help us not only from committing fallacies, but from being misled by them. Now, the specific fallacy that I want to look at is the fallacy of hasty generalization. So there's something that is often said in public discussion, which is wrong, which is that generalization is wrong. Generalization in and of itself is not a fallacy. It can be used as a statistical method of analysis. If you generally observe certain phenomena in a certain environment, you can make conclusions about that environment and make assumptions, policies, and interventions on the basis of those general trends. So generalization in and of itself is not a bad thing. What is a bad thing is a hasty generalization. Let me read. To generalize is to say something about a class of objects on the basis of one's knowledge or experience of some members of that class. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with such a procedure. Indeed, we use it all the time and could not function without it. If it were illegitimate to use this procedure, many of the everyday inferences on which we rely would be illegitimate, an unacceptable result. Occasionally, however, we generalize without adequate knowledge or experience. When this occurs, we are said to commit a fallacy of hasty generalization. Every generalization, hasty or otherwise, has the following form. Number one, all observed instances of X are Y. Therefore, all X are Y. Right? So you've observed instances of X as Y. Therefore, you conclude that all instances of X are Y. From the fact that certain objects from the fact that certain objects within our experience have the characteristic Y, we infer that all such objects have the characteristic Y. The problem with this inference is that the objects with which one has experience may be unrepresentative of the class. They may be unusual or peculiar in some way. Consider the following example. My lawyer did almost no work on my case and ended up charging me a huge sum of money for the effort. Lawyers are crooks, I tell you. The inference is fallacious if the lawyer in question is not representative of lawyers generally, for we all know that this lawyer is one of the corrupt ones. It might not be fallacious, however, if instead of one lawyer, there were several and they had been randomly selected. In general, the more representatives of the class of observed objects, the stronger is the inference that all objects, and not just those observed, have the characteristic in question. It is often said that one cannot generalize from one, two, or a mere handful of instances. Right? So this is what creates the fallacy of hasty generalization. You observe a few instances of something, then you make a conclusion based on all of that. So I want to go back to my original comments. Chidimma is correct to say that some people saw her name, saw that video, and immediately started attacking her and immediately started attacking her identity, her legitimacy. But that's not everyone. And if we then take from that some of the people who did that are Afrophobic, and then say everyone is Afrophobic, we would be the ones committing the hasty generalization. So it is true that not all South Africans are xenophobic, not all South Africans are Afrophobic. It is also true that some of them are. And we have to have nuance in having that discussion. Otherwise, we will talk past each other. We'll talk past each other. So as the discussion was happening, right, there were some people who initially were saying, look, I think it's okay for her to compete, etc. And as they got more information, they were like, maybe she should pull out. And as they found out that there may have been questions with the way her mother obtained the identity documents, that's something that then led for people to say she must withdraw from the competition. I was one of the people who said she must withdraw from the competition because of the way that everything was playing out, particularly with the allegations that her mother stole an ID or someone's identity. That makes it very serious. While Chidimma is innocent in that she did not commit the crime, right, or the alleged crime, and while there are legal remedies that she may be able to access, it then taints her acquisition of that award. This is similar to our conversations about privilege. When we talk about how, certain individuals, relatives and grandfathers and people who lived in certain systems perpetrated violence to black and brown bodies through colonialism, slavery, apartheid. Those who inherited the proceeds of that did not commit those actions, right? But they are in possession of the privilege of the accumulation of resources as a result of those actions. And the social interaction and engagement is one that requires them to be aware of their privilege, to be aware of the systems that may continue to reward them and privilege them and disadvantage other people. So that's a conversation that we already have. And although people agree and disagree on one side or another, the principle, I think, is relatively clear. You may not have been a participant in something actively, but you may be a recipient of privilege that is unearned. And if you receive this unearned privilege in an illegitimate way, that taints your acquisition of benefits, etc. And that's something that I think is worth just being honest about in this conversation about Chidimma. It's also very true that in as much as some people were asking legitimate questions, some people were not asking those questions of other participants. For example, Sherry Wang. She is Asian. From what I've been able to gather, she's of Chinese descent. Nobody questioned whether or not she can compete for Miss South Africa. So there were inconsistencies. But just because there were those inconsistencies, we should be hesitant to make a hasty generalization about the nature of all South Africans as a result of some people who were toxic in the way that they engaged with this. On the other side of the equation as well, when people have conversations about immigration, when people have conversations about immigrant communities, there's often a dismissal of those concerns in a way that is hasty as well and is illegitimate, right? So, for instance, some people have had negative experiences with immigrants. Some people have been victims of crimes committed by immigrants. Some people have lived in neighborhoods where certain types of crimes are committed, where maybe there are drug dealers who are of immigrant ethnicity, where there are people who are practicing prostitution and running prostitution brothels, etc., of immigrant ethnicity. Some people have noticed and are aware of online scams which are run by people who are from the immigrant community. Sometimes those particular identities are Nigerian. But in as much as those experiences are valid, we must also not be hasty in making generalizations to therefore then say that because we experience negative things from particular immigrants, that therefore means that all of those people are the same thing. That is a hasty generalization as well. And this fallacy of hasty generalization is destroying the conversation that we all ought to be having. So what do I mean? Let me give you some data to back up what I'm talking about. The former spokesperson for the Minister of Justice released some information about the prison population. On the 11th of August, this is what he said. There were 212,000 inmates in prison. And of that 212,000 inmates, 9,351 were immigrants. So as a percentage, that represents 4.4% of the population. If you were a victim of the crimes committed by that 9,351, of course, you will say, Nigerians are criminals, or Zimbabweans are criminals, or such and such is a criminal. If these 9,000 people are the ones who committed crimes on you. And obviously, there are criminals who are still operating, who are not arrested, etc. The point that I'm trying to illustrate, though, is that while they are immigrants who are practicing crime, it is in proportion to the population of immigrants living in South Africa. We know from Stats South Africa that there are about 2.4 million immigrants living in South Africa out of the 62 million people living in South Africa. That represents about 3.87% of the population. And then if you then look at the number of prisoners who are immigrants as a ratio of the population, it's more or less the same. Every community will have some people who are transgressive, some people who don't abide by the community standards, etc. But that doesn't therefore mean that everyone from that community is the same. Just because there is Nkabi who is Zulu, who comes from Umlazi and lives a hostel, doesn't mean that everyone who is Zulu is Nkabi. We can all appreciate and understand that. So we can have the conversation about Inkabi without making it a thing about Amazulu, if you get what I'm trying to say. And I think this is the challenge that we're having in having conversations about immigration and about also this Chidimma issue and some of the issues that came up from there. I'll tell you that, I want to keep this short and tell you some of my thoughts and my concerns. I think that there is a real crisis of unregulated immigration in South Africa. I think that we've seen over the last 20 years increase in the population of immigrants, partly due to economics, partly due to just globalization, but the large driver has been dictatorships and rigged elections in the SADC region, particularly in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe. The Frelimo regime in Mozambique has been accused multiple times of rigging elections, of corruption, of a variety of things. The ZANU-PF regime in Zimbabwe has been accused of the same things, and possibly even more draconian versions of the same things. Under Robert Mugabe, there was a dictatorship that lasted 38 years. What is my point? My point is, if the problem is unregulated immigration, and the problem is caused by oppressive and dictatorial regimes in the region, the solution is to actually deal with the oppressive and dictatorial regimes. So there are opportunities when there are elections, to send observer missions, not to ratify elections, etc. If the region stands up to violations of human rights, violations of the African Charter of Democracy, Elections and Governance, that may be one of the ways to solve the problem of unregulated immigration in the region. But if you identify cancer and you don't go for chemotherapy, and maybe the cancer is causing a tumor here, and you keep pulling at the tumor, removing the scab, slow and less, removing it all the time, sure, that will feel like you're treating the problem. But the cancer is in the body. It's caused by cells that are metastasizing, and they need a particular form of treatment. So there's a problem-solution gap sometimes with going to particular individuals and saying, when you are the problem, or you are the problem, etc. Even though that is still something that has to be dealt with, right? Because when you have unregulated immigration, it does affect service delivery. You'll see that in clinics, you'll see that in hospitals. It creates a strain on the fiscus because some of the calculations are based on, local populations. But if people are crossing over borders to give birth because they are scared of their children dying in a empty hospital, for example, which is some of the rural hospitals in Zimbabwe, which don't have any resources whatsoever, that does create strain on the local South African economy and on that healthcare system. It does. But how do you deal with those things long term? How do you deal with those things long term? You have to go to the root of the problem. That's what I think. The second thing I have a concern about, which is a bigger picture thing, but oftentimes I think we don't talk about enough. We have this new continental free trade area and trade agreement that seeks to create, the increase in trade within Africa. Big businesses are already trading within Africa, and they do so relatively with ease. If Pick n Pay wants to go to Nigeria, they won't have a problem to do so. The real area where there's going to be growth potentially in intra-Africa trade is for small to medium-sized businesses. If Drip was selling in Africa, it may not be in the kind of trouble that it is right now if it was easy for Drip to sell all over, right? If Batu was selling all across Africa, that company could be employing way more people. I'm just using examples that are accessible. But the point that I'm trying to make is small businesses, medium-sized businesses, these are the businesses that are really going to benefit from the continental free trade area. But it needs relationships. It needs tolerance. It needs understanding. I'm really concerned that the atmosphere is going the opposite direction, away from tolerance, away from understanding, to more adversarial conversations. Could be wrong, but this is my concern. Over time, those kind of things pose a threat to what we're trying to achieve. If you look continentally, if you look at Asia, they have over 60% intra-Asia trade. The ASEAN bloc, there's a lot of trade between those countries. You look at Europe, over 60% intra-Europe trade. You look at North America, Canada, America, etc. They've got special agreements to make sure that they can trade amongst each other. And that helps those economies to grow. It helps their production base. It helps their unemployment. It helps their economies. SADC region, the economies are not growing so well. And that affects everybody. So sometimes we're looking to grow the economies and the opportunities are right within the continent, but they need us to change how we think and see each other on the continent. I'm really concerned that we are getting further away from that, not closer to that ideal. Maybe the ideal is not realistic. I think it is. I think it's viable. We see it in the ASEAN bloc. We see it in the EU. We see it in North America with North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which is, I think, the older name of that particular free trade agreement. These free trade agreements also lean towards free movement and all of that. And we have to get there. Obviously, there are issues. Obviously, it can't be easy. But if we are all running to hasty generalizations, are we going to get there? I don't know. What do you think? Let's have a conversation. Till the next one.